Okay, let's start. Welcome everyone to our weekly Hot Politics Lab meeting online since, what is it, 8th of March, having super interesting guests. And this week is no exception to that rule. We have today as our speaker, Agneta Fischer, Professor of Psychology at the University of Amsterdam and also Dean of the Faculty of Social Science, the faculty that Bert and I and Christian work for. And so we're super happy to finally have you. I think this was supposed to be a physical meeting and then got postponed, and then Corona, and now we finally have you. And I'm very happy to have Agneta because she is her specialty is emotions, and that's been her field of study for a long time already. And we're very happy to have one of these world experts on emotions in our labs, and that's one of the main topics we study. I see a lot of participants also today, so I'm really still people dropping in even, so I'm really happy to see so many people. Today, Agneta will talk about fear and populism, and so we've deviated a little bit from our previous talks where there was a lot of focus on Corona, but I think everyone has gotten sick of thinking about this, so we gradually are moving back to our more normal repertoire, and so Agneta is the first to go back to the normal repertoire. So without further ado, I want to give maybe just 1 second for people who are new. So Agneta will give a talk for about 20 minutes. Then you can ask your questions, and you can do that through the Q&A tool. So there's in the bottom of your screen in the middle, there are these two clouds. That's the Q&A tool. There you can write your question. And then when Agneta is done, Bert Bakker will facilitate the questions. So he will read them out. Okay. So without further ado, Agneta, I give you the virtual space.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very sweet introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. To see whether this works. Let me see. You don't see the presentation now, right? Only the, is it?
I see the presentation. Yeah, now it's good.
Yeah, now it's good. Okay. So, first of all, I'd like to thank you for being able to present, which is a great honor, of course, because this is a famous webinar in the meantime. And so I'm presenting work of that we have done together with David Abadi, who's also in the audience, and Jan-Willem Duivendak, I think so as well. And this is part of a Horizon 2020 project on democratic efficacy and the varieties of populism in Europe. I will present two different studies, one on the relation between emotions and populism, and the other on Corona, actually, and also on populism. So I'm trying to sneak in the theme again. So I don't need to tell the audience a lot about populism, because many of you have been studying this for a much longer time than I have. So I assume that everyone knows what I'm talking about, and that the idea that populism is on the rise and it can be dangerous for democracy. And there are populists on the left side of the political spectrum and on the right side. And actually it's a way of thinking and explaining rather than a political preference. And so it's also clearly a complex phenomenon, else you would not talk about that or write about it so much. So when we come to a definition, I know there's a lot of debate about definitions of populism, but there are three ingredients that are important for us and for this study. And that is the us versus them thinking. So the us being the common folk and the people, versus them, the elite and the government. The Manichaean outlook, or the dualism, people are morally superior to the elites, so good versus bad. And we also added another element, which is nativism, on which Jan Willem Duivendak has written a lot. And that is mainly the idea that people who are the natives in a country have more rights because their ancestors built the country. So if you look at the literature, then there are actually two different types of explanations for populist voting or populist attitudes. And these are the socio-economic factors like unemployment, low education, etc. And the social psychological factors that are more recent theories about populism. And they argue that it's not actually the actual economic hardship, but rather the feeling of being mistreated, the being anxious, the being angry, etc., etc. And so this is also a form of relative deprivation, because it's important how other people are, what other people experience, whether other people are unemployed or poor or rich, rather than the mere fact that you are that yourself. So this is actually about the basis of these social psychological theories and emotional theories is that people who are anxious have to deal with that. They have to be, being anxious actually is a very negative state of mind, and people feel uncertain, and being uncertain is something that you want to get rid of. And there are different ways of doing that. And so you can run away, you can withdraw from social life, you can try to control your anxiety with taking measures like wearing face masks, or you can blame others, which is also a way of getting rid of your uncertainty about causes and so on, because feeling angry is actually a much more pleasant experience than feeling uncertain. And so this is what people want to do. At least this is our assumption, and in other types of research it has been shown, and anger gives you a feeling of control, and in that sense it is more pleasant and more positive even experience than being anxious. So in the first study, we wanted to test the relative importance of socio-economic versus socio-psychological and emotional factors in explaining populism. So there has been more and more research about emotions, and the organizers of this webinar are one of the prominent authors in that, showing that emotions do play a role. But in this study, we wanted to compare the different types of factors that could explain the increase in populism. So we did a large survey in 15 different European countries, and these countries are all part of this project. You can see how complicated this whole Demos project is because of all these different countries which are involved. And so we did it with an online survey, and we collected the data last year, and the total number of participants is 8,059. What did we measure? I'm not going to mention all the measures because that is too much in 15 minutes, but of course we measured populist attitudes because that was the main dependent variable, with different types of scales, as I just mentioned. We measured different types of socio-economic indicators, inequality. There was inequality at the country level, which is based on the inequality of income distribution. And so we coded the different countries on the basis of this index. We had individual employment status, education level, and perceived social status. So that is how you see yourself on the social ladder compared to other people in your country. And then you have the social psychological indicators, such as the social identity scale, anxiety measured by how threatening people find some things in the future, like whether they have proper housing or proper income, but also symbolic threats like whether they are afraid that the number of immigrants in the country will destroy their traditions and so on. So this is called realistic and symbolic threats. And we had measures of anger and contempt that were based on my own previous work in intergroup relations and interpersonal relationships. So this is basically the fact that anger also always includes other blame and the tendency to attack or confront, whereas contempt is the tendency to look down at others or to look down at the elite, for instance, in this case, and to withdraw and ignore those people. So anger and contempt are both negative emotions, that is quite clear, but they have different assessments of the situation and different types of tendencies to deal with it. Okay, so these were the measures. We have, this is the slide of the correlations with the blue correlations indicating the positive ones, the red, the negative ones, and you can clearly see that there are positive correlations between anger, anxiety, and contempt and populist attitudes, and only actually no significant correlations between populist attitudes and the socio-economic indicators. So people with more populist attitudes feel more anxious, are more angry, and feel more contempt towards the government. We also conducted several path analyses, and if you have further questions, I will explain it, but if you have more detailed questions, you can ask David about that. I can say that now. So we tested the structural relation between these variables. This is the more advanced structural equation model in which we tested whether the direct and indirect relationships between inequality index and populist attitudes and between anxiety and populist attitudes are significant, and what direction they have. And what you see here, for instance, is there is a significant relation between inequality and populist attitudes, but it's really, really very small, and it's also negative. Whereas the relation between the emotions, anxiety, anger, and contempt on populist attitudes is much larger. Actually, it's 0.28. And what you also see is that anger and contempt mediate the relation between anxiety and the populist attitudes. So on the basis of that advanced model, you can argue that emotional factors play a larger role in the development or the increase in populist attitudes in comparison with these socio-economic factors, of which, by the way, education has the largest effect of 0.17. It's the only actual significant effect. So we also tested, used other models in testing this idea, and all these models actually confirmed the idea that emotions are more important than socio-economic factors. So in a second study, so this was study 1. In the second study, we wanted to further explore the role of anxiety or fear in populist attitudes. And the main reason is that we wanted to see whether the anxiety that people nowadays feel with respect to being contaminated by corona would also affect their populist attitudes, because we thought that any type of anxiety, so also anxiety for corona, could sparkle populist sentiments based on this idea that I referred to earlier, that people who are uncertain, anxious, seek certainty by following strong and simple beliefs about the state of the world. And so the us versus them, the good versus evil, the beliefs in conspiracies can explain the big events in the world. And so that would be the relation between corona and populism. So we had a couple of questions. So what are the individual factors that predict anxiety for the coronavirus? Is corona anxiety related to other types of anxiety, like symbolic or environmental threats? Does corona anxiety lead to stronger populist attitudes, anger at the government or anger at others? And does it lead to more approval of and compliance with hygiene measures that are being announced by the government? And is this maybe mediated by the populist attitudes? So again, we did an online survey, which is very handy in these times, much better than focus groups or interviews. And so we had 4 different countries: Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. We didn't have time yet to look at the differences between the different countries here, but that will be interesting because of the different ways in which the governments in these countries have reacted to the crisis. But this is all preliminary. So we had 3 types of anxiety. Anxiety about contamination with the coronavirus, anxiety about the symbolic threats, and anxiety about environmental threats. Then we had conspiracy mentality, populist attitudes, anger at the government, approval of and compliance with hygiene measures, which I will explain in a second, anger at others, and that is basically other persons who transgress the rules that have been set by the governments, and pro-social behavior. And so the hygiene measures that we measured we had 9 different ones. Well, you can read it on the screen. The interesting thing is, this is just an aside, that so we asked whether people approved of the measures and whether they actually behaved conform the measures. And in actually most of the cases, people approved them but didn't behave like that, which I find very funny. But there are 2 that were really didn't show any difference. So the hand washing, this is what people approve of and actually do, and the staying at home when you are sick or have a cold as well. But for all the rest of the measures, that doesn't count. Okay, so further results, and they are preliminary, as I said. So the first question that we had what types of individual predictors actually relate to the anxiety about corona. And we did a linear logistic regression in 3 different steps. The first, the age, gender, and country. Only gender had a significant effect. Then employment, education, and subjective social status. Only employment had an effect. And conspiracy mentality, the belief the beliefs in conspiracy theories was actually the best predictor all these different predictors. So if you so women are more anxious, self-employed and unemployed people are more anxious than employed people, and people who tend to believe in conspiracies are also more anxious. If you look at the relation with other types of anxiety, what you see is anxiety about corona is correlated with the environmental anxiety, but not with the immigration anxiety. So this is also interesting. Here again, the correlation table. Here the red is the positive and the blue is the negative. What you see over here, if you look at the anxiety about corona, this is highly correlated with a lot of different things. So people who are anxious have more populist attitudes, stronger conspiracy mentality, are more angry at the government, are more angry at other people, approve more the hygiene measures, but also comply to them more. And so here if you look at the populist attitudes, you see the same pattern as we saw in study 1. So this seems to be at least a little robust. And for the rest, I'm not going into all the other things. But as I said, anxiety about corona is related, and that is for you guys who are interested in populism. It is related to populist attitudes. We need to establish the structural relation between all these different measures, because what we want to test is whether populism mediates the relation between anxiety and approval of and compliance to these hygiene measures. And so we are still doing all kinds of structural equation modeling to find that out, but we haven't finished that yet. So conclusion. I think emotion, it's not, for me, it's not a surprise, of course, but I think emotions do play a very important role in populist attitudes. They seem to be more important than mere socioeconomic factors, but of course you could argue that this has to do with the way in which we have measured both things, which is still, well, that is a discussion, of course. A second conclusion is that anxiety may be at the basis of other negative emotions, which makes sense because of the uncertainty element, and is related therefore to populist attitudes. And as I said, we will further test the mediating and effects of the different variables in the relation between anxiety and compliance to measures, actually behavior. Okay, that was it.
Okay, thank you very much, Agneta, for this all this new data on important topics, and I'm also impressed that while managing our faculty and making sure that we can do our research and teach, you're also still doing a lot of research at the same time. So now we have more than half an hour for questions, and there is already a first question in the Q&A box. And so people who are listening, feel free to write a question and I will read it out and Agneta will answer. So Agneta, the first question is the question from Robin Tochel from the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. I have two questions about the first study. The first is, do populist attitudes work well as one factor? I would expect that the nativism distinguishes populist leanings to the left from those leaning to the right. And the second question is, did you take any look at political leaning, left, right? And if so, do you find differences between those groups? In other words, socioeconomic factors being more important for left-leaning individuals with populist attitudes versus the right-leaning individuals?
Yeah, I think that is a very good. So the question is actually, so So the last question was about the political preference, right? Whether that makes a difference.
Yeah, so whether or not that's conditioning the effects of the socio-economic factors.
This is a very good question, and I remember that we did some analysis on that, but I don't remember anymore what came out because we did so many different analyses. David, are you in? Or can he?
I don't think he has the right to speak
Oh,
in
no, he cannot
the
speak.
Zoom
Can you make him speak?
in a Zoom format.
Okay, now I'm alone here. So actually, I don't know. But I do think it is a very important question, and I should check that. So what was the first question? Because that was also
the first question is whether or not populist attitudes work well as a factor. Yeah. So is it the nativism that distinguishes populists leaning to the left from those leaning to the right?
Okay, so we did check for these different scales, and so populist attitudes works as a scale in the sense that it's reliable. Actually, nativism was the scale that we made ourselves, which was the most reliable one, better than the other ones. And I remember that nativism has the strongest effects to populist attitudes in certain countries, but not in all countries. So what we want to do, but still have to do, is whether we can see different clusters of populism in the different countries based on these different scales that we use. But for the predictions that we did, I remember that nativism was one of the strongest. And with respect to the second question, with regard to the political preference, I also know that there is literature on different emotions that would play a role for left-wing people and right-wing people in relation to populism. For instance, shame would be differentially important. I think that would be important for the left-wing populism rather than the right wing, and this is, I think it is important, and as I said, I don't remember exactly what came out of that. Okay. Oh, look, David is in.
Yeah, we gave David the right to speak now. So. Welcome, David. He is not ready to. Well, we'll go on to this next question, and then and now we have David in there as well. So once he wants to answer, he could unmute his microphone. The second question is from Matthijs Roodaan. Thank you, Agneta. This is very interesting. I have a question about your focus on populist attitudes. I like that approach. Yet I was wondering if you've also assessed populist voting. We know that many people have populist attitudes, but that much less people actually vote for populist parties. Do you find similar patterns when examining actual voting behavior?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Actually, we have thought a lot about whether we would measure the voting, but because we involved so many different countries, it was very difficult to define what would be the populist parties and what not. And so this was actually the more practical reason, you could say, that we decided to use populist attitudes. And the other reason is, well, I think we did not measure what parties people voted for. We did have a measure of whether, I think we did have a measure of whether they were left or right wing, which we could correlate with the attitudes. Do you remember that, David, whether we had that or not? Your mic is off. Or Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Now we can hear you.
So, hello everyone. I'm David, the co-author of that paper Agneta just presented. So I unfortunately cannot see the previous questions by Robin and Matthijs. Bert, could you please?
I can't show you the questions. So I can only read them. So the question from Matthijs is basically, did you measure populist voting, and if so, to what extent do you see the same patterns when it comes to voting behavior compared to the populist attitudes?
Yeah, we did actually in the first study last summer. We asked for people's voting behavior, but we have not actually included in any analysis because we have so far more than 100 variables. But that is something we will tackle in our future research, because the next step is actually to look into these different clusters of left-wing and right-wing populism, as Agneta mentioned before. Yeah, so.
But did we ask, was it an open question what they voted for, which party?
In the first study, we asked whether they have voted and what party they have voted.
Okay, so
or what direction, not the particular party, but like what political ideology. And in the second study, the online experiments on Corona pandemic, we asked actually. Participants had to answer on a scale between -5 and +5, between basically left wing and right wing. On that scale, they had to actually answer or position themselves.
Okay.
Okay.
Does it answer your question, Matthijs?
Matthijs has no right to. Matthijs has no right. But we'll never know, Agneta.
No. I have to turn to. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. The next question is from Daphne van der Pas. Thank you very much for this very interesting research and the presentation. You mentioned that emotional factors apparently are more important than the socio-economic factors. At the end, you also mentioned that this conclusion also depends on how they are measured. I'm wondering how you see the relation between emotions and socio-economic factors. In the SEM model, I think they were modeled separately. So where do these emotions come from, and do the socio-economic factors actually play a role here?
Yeah, that is a very good question, of course. I think that socioeconomic and emotional factors are actually rather independent of each other. There are many people who are poor and still happy, or who have all kinds of conditions and are still happy, and people who are very rich and educated who are grumpy all the time. So I think this has more to do with some kind of personality characteristics and so on than with the socio-economic factors. I'm sorry, I lost the second question. I'm sort of.
I think that was yeah. So basically, I think you've answered the question, because Daphne's question was, whether or not you think that the socioeconomic factors play a role in affecting these emotions.
Yeah, I actually don't think so.
Okay. We go to the next question from Isabella Ribasso, who's a PhD student at the Department of Political Science and working in our lab. Thanks for your talk. My question is about the causes of anxiety, which you find to be first in the causal chain from emotion to populist attitudes. How do you expect that feelings of anxiety emerge if this is neither socioeconomic factors nor cue taking from political elites, which would only work once populist attitudes are already present? Or is the cause ultimately trait anxiety or trait anger?
Nice question. The question is what causes this anxiety?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the case of Corona, it's quite clear. So I don't think I have to answer that question. And that is probably also, by the way, influenced by sort of state anxiety where you're talking about. So some people are just more anxious than others. But the anxiety in the first question, indeed, has to do with, so it comes from theories on social identity. And one's social identity is based on whether one belongs to a group and whether that feels good, and whether one feels safe in the group. And as soon as people have the idea that this identity is being threatened because the values of the group or the status of the group, etc., is being attacked, then people become anxious, and there are different strategies how to save your social identity, actually. But this is actually, I think, the sort of very common global cause of anxiety. And there are more specific events that may sort of reinforce or evoke actual fears, which is more concrete than the sort of underlying anxiety that people have. And I do agree with you if you state that it has something to do, with socio-economic factors. So people who are poor and see no perspective are more likely, in that sense, to feel anxious about the future. I do think that is the case, but it is not necessary. That doesn't necessarily mean that people who are angry at the government or who are feel contempt for the government also, whether that directly relates to their socio-economic situation. So the social identity, actually we assumed that social identity would have a stronger, would be a stronger factor in this whole model, but that was not the case, and it may also be different in different countries, by the way. But so I think so to summarize. I think that it's not so I think that the fact that we are trying to do causal modeling doesn't mean that it starts with anxiety just like that. Then it predicts something else, and that predicts something else, because there is, of course, a sort of continuous relationship between these different things. Yeah, this was a bit of a long answer to a question.
I can't speak for Isabella, but I think it covers what she asked. The next question is from Patrick Stewart from Arkansas. This is wonderful and incredible salient research. Thank you for presenting. Given the current events in the United States and other nations, what suggestions would you give policymakers given your findings?
That is a difficult question. Policymakers, well, one of the things that policymakers should not do is increase the negative emotions of people. And so rather than making people more angry and more anxious and feeling more unsafe, you should acknowledge that that they see threats, acknowledge that there are problems, acknowledge that there are differences between people who are treated better than others, and just saying that people who are angry are rioters would be not the way to would not be the way to have a democratic and peaceful society, I would say. But this is, of course, a very global answer to this question. It also depends on the type of situation in which politicians react to certain events.
Yeah, Okay. Next question is from Bram Spruit from the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. Thank you for the interesting presentation. You compare the relative importance of the socio-economic versus the emotional factors. Do these emotions in any meaningful way moderate the effect of the socio-economic factors, on populist attitudes?
David?
David, do you want to answer this question?
He doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's been a while, but well, we found some evidence for mediation effects, and with regard to this, I mean that does also depends on the model. So this is again not a question to answer in one or two sentences. I would say to wrap it up, I would say it all depends. But in general, yes, they play a role in moderating the effects. But whether they are significantly or whether they are significant compared to other factors, that remains a question, I would say.
I'm just looking at the, yeah. Oh. Okay. So you can do this. So we have done a lot of modeling, and just to also to add to what David already said, and it is quite clear that these different variables are very related to each other, but that in all these models, the emotional ones come out as the most important ones in explaining populist attitudes.
Maybe in that context, I can add basically a complementary, confirmatory research we conducted, and this is the random forest prediction model, which you see here, which confirmed and complemented both SAM models. Which random forest for those of you who don't know it, it's an inductive supervised machine learning algorithm. So I think the results are quite impressive, and again, it confirmed all kind of models we created before, including the basic and the advanced SAM model.
Okay, Gijs, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, I did. Thanks also, David, for these complementary results. I was just puzzling over them for a bit, forgetting my question, but I think I have it again. So I'm particularly sort of intrigued here by the sort of the combination of emotions that leads to the output of populist attitudes. But my question is, maybe it relates a bit to what Matthijs asked before. But consider the following scenario, that both populist attitudes and the reported emotions people feel towards government are both the outcome, the product of voting for populists, and not really the cause. And I understand you didn't look at voting behavior, but I mean, once a person decides to take cues from a particular elite group, then these cues may very well be also not in terms of attitudes, like you think that people should have full autonomy, but it may also be the emotionality of these cues that people take over. So indeed, they become more angry at the government, and there's some very old evidence from also from a SAM model from my office mate, who I haven't seen in 4 months, Wout van der Brug, who showed that particularly political trust actually is both a cause of populist voting, but also a consequence. And so this sort of more iterative model, is this do you see this as a possibility? What's your take on it?
If I can answer first, I completely agree. I think this is a possibility, and I think it doesn't exclude each other. So the emotions can be a cause and an effect of populist voting. It need not be one. But I'm not sure, and that's this is where David needs to. I'm not sure whether we tested that. I actually don't think so. But
yeah, so what we did in the first study across 15 European countries is we basically asked a question: did you vote during the last elections? And this is of course not sufficient to answer a good question you just asked, Gijs. But in our last study, we asked a couple of questions regarding voting behavior, including the political orientation of the respondent on a left-wing, right-wing spectrum. Perhaps there is a possibility to answer that question. If you guys have any suggestions, recommendations, advice, yeah, would really appreciate it.
But I think one of the options could be that we say that we treat the populist attitudes not as the sort of end variable to be explained by the others, but as a predictor of the emotions.
Yeah.
That was the idea, I think.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
So
whether that would be an equally good model.
Yeah.
So this is so with regard to this political spectrum, this is a model I've been just testing a few days ago, whether it predicts any of the major scales. I've been kind of like playing with it. It's definitely interesting, and but it hasn't been a priority so far. But we will definitely look into it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
The next question is from Maaike Homan, also from our lab and the Department of Political Science. Thanks for the great presentation. I was wondering how the negative emotions interact with each other. You mentioned that anger mediates the effect of anxiety on populist attitudes. Could you explain it a little bit more? Do feelings of anxiety perhaps turn into anger?
Yeah, exactly. That is that is the case. So I think anxiety, if people are anxious, they are more likely to become angry or to feel contempt because of the feelings of uncertainty underlying this anxiety, because people want to get rid of it, and blaming others or looking down at others is a very good and efficient way to get rid of your own uncertainty. But it is, by the way, not necessary to be anxious in order to become angry. So you can become angry because you feel very frustrated, or because you really think that someone did the wrong things, etc., etc. So it's not a precondition, but it helps if you are anxious.
Okay, another question from Matthijs. Oh, he was, by the way, satisfied with your previous answer. In the second study, you examined both populist attitudes and conspiracy mentality. To what extent would you conceptualize populism as a specific manifestation of a conspiracy mentality?
Oh, that is interesting. I think you could, but conspiracy theories, or this conspiracy mentality, is basically that people tend to think in terms of big causes of big events that are hidden from the audience. So it is a bit more specific, I think, than, at least in the way in the way it is measured, than populist attitudes in general. So therefore, it makes sense that they are related, these different concepts. But in my view, it's not the same.
Okay. Yeah. Next question from Robin from the Amsterdam School of Communication Research again. The behavioral change literature often talks about the need for concern, worry, or anxiety as a prerequisite. However, a sense of efficacy is one of the key moderators deciding whether this anxiety leads to action or disengagement. Would you think that a higher sense of efficacy would possibly also play a role in your models? In other words, could efficacy prevent people from developing populist attitudes?
Our Horizon 2020 project is called Democratic Efficacy and Varieties of Populism. So the idea was indeed that if people have the feeling that they can contribute to democracy, that they can be involved in decision making, etc., that would decrease their populist attitudes and populist voting. So I think theoretically this is completely right. We haven't, I think, in this whole project there hasn't been a good operationalization of democratic efficacy yet. So we have some measures, but we are all not very satisfied with it. It's very difficult to measure that, especially cross-nationally, because it's about knowledge. It's about whether people have the feeling that that it makes sense for them to be involved. Theoretically, I think this is a good argument, and empirically, I don't think we have yet sufficient evidence for that.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, and then I'll hand the floor over to Gijs to close the meeting. So this is a question that I wanted to ask you. It's based on a comment you made in an earlier seminar that we were both attending, when we're talking about what are these emotions actually in the domain of politics? Are these sort of short, immediate, effective states, or are it more sort of attitudinal constructs that over time you, maybe by taking cues from your political party, have sort of adopted, that you have some sort of latent feeling of anger towards the government? So the question is, like, how do we need to conceptualize emotions in the domain of politics, as more sort of short-lived effective states, or more attitudinal constructs that have a more fixed position in who we are and how we approach the world?
Yeah, I think that is a very good question. I think both, actually. And so the way we measure this, is more in terms of sentiments and attitudes. So we ask how angry are you at the government, etc. This is not a specific event that we measure, because that is difficult. And so what we have measured is more the attitudes. But if you have attitudes that represent a sort of anger towards the government, then it is also more likely, of course, that you will become more angry if something happens. So you see that nowadays in the United States, you see that also in the Netherlands. So if something happens regarding discrimination, racism, etc., and if people already have an attitude, for instance, that they say, well, the government doesn't do anything about it, and when that is your underlying attitude, then you will become more angry as soon as something happens. So I think you need both.
That's good. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Well, I'll hand the floor for Gijs for the last words.
Thank you, Agneta, for a wonderful talk, and thank you, David, for the assistance. Both of you will get this wonderful Hot Politics Lab.
Oh, I loved it.
Once I'm back in the office, that's don't know when that will happen. But, I hope to see both of you soon again in the lab or physically at our campus. Let me end today. We have a few more minutes with announcing the remainder of our schedule for this academic year. We have very long academic years in the Netherlands. Some of you might have stopped teaching already. I started teaching this week again. We'll be busy until the end of June. And so we have 3 more exciting meetings lined up for you. Next week from 3 to 4, we have Ryan Boyd from the University of Lancaster to talk on psychology and verbal behavior. The Ryan Boyd is originally from the James Pennebaker lab, and among other things, studies the language, the psychological characteristics of the language that politicians use. So I think this is going to be a super interesting talk. The week after that, we have Chris Federico to talk about, now I had the exact same problem last week. What is this talk about there?
Collective narcissism and national identity.
Yeah, I mean, it's couldn't be more topical, I think. That will be from 4 to 5 because Chris is based in the US. And then the last meeting of this academic year, the 26th of June, from 3 to 4 again, we have a PhD lab meeting where Isabella Rebasso will talk about the data collection. We're about to get started on the role of anger and fear in politics. And Tobias Rohrbach, a PhD student from the University of Fribourg, who will actually talk about researching emotions in a qualitative way, and we'll talk about his Think Aloud protocols that he is planning to use in an upcoming data collection. So lots of interesting stuff, and even though we will close for a bit, I think we will be back in half August, and so we're already preparing, I should rephrase, we should start preparing our schedule for next year. So if you're interested in giving a talk, please let us know. I'm pretty sure that for a while we'll be doing this online, and so it doesn't really matter where you live, as long as you have something to contribute to our main topic, you're very welcome to give a talk. I think that's it for today. Thanks again, everybody, and have a good week.